Over the next 2 days, under President Lee's leadership, we'll move ahead with the urgent work of preventing nuclear terrorism by securing the world's nuclear materials. Now, this is an important part of the broader, comprehensive agenda that I want to talk with you about today. Our vision of a world without nuclear weapons.
Well, that's the president speaking in Seoul, South Korea, a little more than a year ago. At that time, the United States was pursuing a policy to achieve a world without nuclear weapons. And as we know it as of now, that still is the policy of this administration. An editorial in the Washington Post this weekend caught our eye because of that. In it, several prominent policy makers say the president's policy on nuclear weapons is dangerous to us. And they argue that with threats from Iran and from North Korea, making a no nukes policy is unrealistic and should be rethought. One of the authors of that article, Frank Gaffney, is joining us. He's the president of the Center for Security Policy and former Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Reagan administration. Also with us is Joe Cirincione, president of Phoughshares Fund and the author of Bomb Scare, the History and Future of Nuclear Weapons. We've talked to Joe a few times about disarmament when it comes to nuclear weapons. Nice to have you both today.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Frank, tell us a little bit about the main argument of your editorial. Why do you think that this rhetoric of a no-nuke policy is dangerous?
Well, it's fitting we're having this conversation today. This whole idea of ridding the world of nuclear weapons would be a sort of classic April Fool's hoax if it hadn't been going on for so long and if it weren't so serious. And that's for basically three reasons. You cannot disinvent nuclear weapons, especially when their technology is in the hands of countries like North Korea and Iran. I think, even if you could somehow achieve that, would find that a world without nuclear weapons is actually a more dangerous world. It's one that we've experienced before. We've had two horrific global cataclysms in the course of a world without nuclear weapons, and I don't think we want to go back to that. And then finally, the question of whether or not just trying to get this is a cost-free or even desirable thing, I think has been proven by the North Korean crisis of the moment to be untrue. When the United States signals its desire to denuclearize, which President Obama, by the way, is doing. He's leading from in front in this case, trying to get the rest of the world to follow, but nobody else seems to be following at all in this respect. Well, but when we do that, I think it engenders a concern on the part of our allies, and it certainly emboldens our enemies. And for all these reasons, I think this is a hoax at best, and at worst, it's really an invitation to disaster.
So a lot of different reasons there, Joe, and you could pick up off of any that you'd like. I'd like to just draw a little bit of attention to Frank's last point, which he talks about North Korea, and he says, listen, you know, if we can't get our enemies on board with this no-nuke policy, then why should we consider it?
Yeah. Well, it was President Kennedy who said we have to abolish the weapons of war before they abolish us. It was Ronald Reagan who said that his hope was eliminate nuclear weapons from the face of the earth. And Ronald Reagan started to do something about it. He slashed the U.S. nuclear arsenal by about 50%, getting the Soviets to come down the same way. George H.W. Bush cut it another 50%. George W. Bush cut it another 50%. President Obama hasn't made that many cuts, but now he's listening to his military. They say we have far more nuclear weapons than we need, and they're expensive. The money we spend on nuclear weapons is taking money away from the troops, particularly as Congress starts to cut the U.S. national defense budget. So when you look at North Korea, they have maybe 2 or 3 nuclear weapons, maybe as many as 10. How many do we actually need? It's hard to imagine us using one.
How many do we need, Joe?
Well,
I mean,
you can imagine that we might need, say, 50, which using 50 would be a catastrophe, unprecedented in history. Maybe you want to be safe and say 500. We have 5,000 nuclear weapons. That's what the military is telling the president. You can cut that by 1,000, maybe 1,500, and still satisfy all our national security needs and save hundreds of billions of dollars in the process.
So, Frank, Joe says we're safe. I mean, we have what we need. Why not save a little money and cut the stuff that we don't need? Listen to our military, as Joe says.
Yeah. Joe didn't respond to a single one of the objections that I've raised about his objective, which is to rid the world of nuclear weapons. And I worked for President Reagan on nuclear weapons policy, and I can tell you, we're living today on the legacy of President Reagan's commitment to rebuild our nuclear deterrent. We haven't done much of it since. And this is the problem, is what Joe has accomplished with his strategy of denuclearizing the United States, in the hopes that everybody else will follow, of course, is creating conditions under which we have weapons that are simply obsolete and not as safe, not as reliable, not as effective as they need to be. And if I were the military, I'd be concerned not simply about the numbers of weapons that we have, but the quality of weapons we have and the ability to deter countries that may behave as erratically as the North Koreans are behaving at the moment.
Well,
that's a job that I think they need to be worrying about and don't seem to be as well as they should.
If I could jump in there just for a moment, Frank, on that point, though, one of the arguments that you make in your editorial is that having nuclear weapons deters proliferation, but we have seen, even though we have nuclear weapons, it hasn't deterred proliferation at all. We've seen North Korea nuke up. We're worried about Iran now. So how much of a deterrent is it really to have all these weapons?
Well, I think the point we're making is we've had relatively little nuclear proliferation during a period when the United States maintained a very strong, very robust, very credible deterrent, not only for its own protection, but for those of our friends and allies. And here's the real problem, is as people have begun to see that we're not serious about this, following this global zero idea of the president's particularly, they have begun to calculate maybe they better get their own. And I think what you're going to see as this proceeds, perhaps in places like South Korea, in Japan, in Taiwan, in, who knows, the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, and so on, is going to be more and more people deciding they need to have their own deterrence because they can't rely on ours. That's a formula for not only greater proliferation, but for global instability. And I shouldn't think that any of us would want that.
So, Joe, on this idea of, speak softly and carry a big stick, right? If the world is getting more dangerous, is there something in the symbolism of having a lot of nuclear weapons and just being more ready, more prepared, more nuked up, for lack of a better term, than anybody else in the world?
Well, Frank is so eloquent in stating his rather extreme position and characterizing
That was very nice, Joe. What a nice compliment.
I'll take it.
Thank you. Nobody's talking about unilateral disarmament. Nobody's talking about getting rid of our nuclear weapons anytime soon. What everybody is talking about is rationalizing the nuclear force. We used to have 35,000 nuclear weapons. So did the Soviets. We've cut that. We're down to about 5,000 now, and we see the Russians coming down the same way. This is still many, many times more than the other countries in the world have in their relatively small nuclear arsenals. So you can see the argument is we can go further down together, verifiable, mutual steps, step by step reducing it. And when we do that, we build up the international cooperation you need to prevent new states from getting it, not to convince Pyongyang that they should follow us, but to convince the countries around North Korea to continue the pressure to contain and eventually roll back that. It's two sides of the same coin. You reduce, you build up the international cooperation. Joe. You build up the international cooperation, you create the conditions for further reducing. There are fewer countries with nuclear weapons now than there were 30 years ago, fewer countries trying to get them, and it's very
Not
small.
True.
Yeah, it is true. There's only North Korea and Iran.
I've just mentioned half a dozen that are going to go nuclear, Joe, unfortunately, because of the conditions you're helping to create.
I don't believe that's true.
We need a debate on this.
Increasing its standing in the world.
We absolutely need a debate on this.
If we could, we'd love that debate to happen live on our air. So we're going to leave it there for now.
Thank you, General.
But we'd love
Let's
to have you
do
both
more
back because it's a good conversation.
Happy April Fools, Joe.
Well, come on, you guys, keep
See you again, Frank.
Keep it nice
this
and
is the
friendly
point.
here, right? April
This
1st.
is the point.
That's right. Thank you for having us.
Joe,
No
Frank,
hoaxes.
thank you very much. Talk to you soon.
My pleasure. Thank you.
An emotional